Washington, D.C. is up to Washington, D.C. tricks because 25 members of Congress have just introduced a bill that would add a 1,000% sales tax to any so-called assault weapon. And wait till you see how this is defined, because almost everything is an assault weapon according to this bill, as well as any so-called high-capacity magazine, aka normal capacity magazine. This would turn a $500 firearm into one that might cost $5,000 or more. Guys, let's get into it. So while both Republicans and Democrats have had their turns throughout history of basically taking shots at the Second Amendment, today we're talking about Democrats. We're talking about specifically Representative Don Beyer, who's a Democrat from Virginia, as well as 24 other House Democrats who have introduced this legislation. Now, let me just state the obvious that this doesn't look like it's going anywhere right now. But rest assured, if they could pass this at some future point, this could absolutely be coming down the pipes, which therefore makes it still relevant to talk about. So I mentioned in the intro that, look, 1,000% excise tax, technically that's a sales tax, would be imposed on all semi-automatic assault weapons, again, however that's defined. Let's look at how that's defined. Now, this would be defined the same way as under last year's bill when they introduced basically something very analogous, and this is how it's defined. A semi-automatic rifle or pistol with a fixed magazine of 10 rounds or more, or that have other various features. A fixed magazine of 10 rounds or more, or of other various features. Again, pretty open-ended. I don't know about you, but I think virtually every pistol this side of revolvers and a couple subcompact single stacks, things like that. And of course, 2 world wars, the GI 1911, everything's going to have 10 rounds or more, or just about. So in essence, we're talking about putting 1,000% sales tax on virtually the most accessible firearms, that being handguns, used for self-defense around the country. So let's take a look at some law on this. So we're going to go back to 1819, McCulloch v. Maryland, where Chief Justice John Marshall said, quote, "The power to tax involves the power to destroy, that the power to destroy may defeat and render useless the power to create," end quote. Isn't that a great phrase? And unfortunately, as I think we all know, it's all too true. You start putting 1,000%, or heck, why stop there? Let's start adding some zeros to that. You wind up putting 1,000,000% sales tax on something, and suddenly no one can afford it. So really, at the end of the day, you've just destroyed that. And make no mistake, that's exactly what we're talking about here as well. Effectively trying to destroy the Second Amendment. What this kind of reminds me of is the history of poll taxes. So for those of you who don't remember this, or maybe never learned it, the poll tax, what was it? What is it? Well, basically it's a tax that you have to pay to the government in order to exercise your right to vote. Why was it ever passed? Why are most laws passed? To control who has power to do things like that. Who was impacted? Well, obviously people who could pay it, wealthy folks and so forth, everybody's impacted, but impacts them much less, they could still vote. People without money and people without power, which oftentimes, looking at the time and place of when these laws were passed, included Southern blacks, poor whites, and women after the passage of the 19th Amendment. Those are the people who were, of course, most acutely affected, since this meant they could no longer vote. Poll taxes, of course, have been used all around the world, and the United States is no exception. Now, I will note that initially, poll taxes were actually found to be constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1937, which, of course, would subsequently trigger in 1964 the passage of the 24th Amendment, which outlawed the practice at the federal level. Just the same, 5 southern states persisted, and once more, that particular issue, the poll tax, you're going to see how this all connects, was brought to the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Harper versus Virginia Board of Elections, 1966. In that case, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision, ruled that the poll tax violated the Equal Protection Clause. This overturned, again, that earlier decision in Breedlove versus Suttles. That's the 1937 case that I mentioned here earlier. The majority declared in this case, in Harper, that the eligibility to vote has no rational connection to the wealth of an individual. Therefore, the poll tax fails to meet the heightened standard of review applied to restrictions on voting that is a fundamental right thanks to the 14th Amendment. Now, it's worth remembering that there was no textual basis for the reversal of the 1937 decision, since the 24th Amendment applied only to federal elections, meaning there was an argument with the poll tax, at least on a legal basis, perhaps on a moral one at the state level. All right, so I'm going to tie the whole thing together and also give you my bottom line points, as well as, of course, our ever popular quote of the day. But before I do, let us know that you like this content. Let the algorithm know. Hit that like button. It's absolutely free. It takes a moment. Make sure you don't miss any future content that we put out there if you just happen to be browsing through and found us. Thank you for joining. Thank you to all of our steady viewers and watchers. If you want to support the channel, we do have a join button for membership and some extra things that we give away. But again, we appreciate everybody just stopping by. Back to the bottom line wrap up. Couple different thoughts. Is there a rational connection between possessing a firearm and wealth? Because I guess in this case, the Democrats think so. Otherwise, they would not be sponsoring this bill. Because if we look at the effect, and you're always hearing me kind of bang on about the fact that we should not judge a bill based off what someone behind a microphone says it will do. We should judge a bill based off what it will do. And all this bill would actually accomplish, if someday it were ever turned to be law, would be to disarm poor families who, frankly, probably need these weapons the most to defend themselves if we're talking about robbers and street toughs and things like that. After all, who tend to live in high crime areas? Rich people or poor people? Who tend to live in high crime areas? Persons of color or whites? So who is this Democrat bill really targeting? Poor people and persons of color. This bill is basically saying that all of you guys, you don't need weapons to protect yourself. Basically, if we now look at this on the other side of the coin, the only people who should have firearms are the people who can't afford them. Presumably, if the demographics are any cue, we're talking about people who are wealthy, we're talking about whites, we're talking about Asians, and just in general, people of means. So who did the, again, Democrats claim to represent? Moreover, if the price of guns goes up on the legal market, what effect will that have on the illegal market? Will there be a higher demand or a lower demand for illegal guns if firearm prices become prohibitively expensive at gun stores? If less people are purchasing firearms at gun stores, will this result in more or less background checks? So this bill is, in a way, anti-background checks as well. Just thought I'd throw that out there. Today's quote of the day comes from Baron de Montesquieu. Quote, "Useless laws weaken the necessary ones," end quote. Wonder why I chose that. Thanks very much, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this one, please feel free to check out some of our other great content, and we'll see you in the next one.